The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the kind of detail that stayed with a person longer than it had any right to. Margaret Elise Calloway had been in the middle of conjugating French verbs on the chalkboard when the school's handyman, old Mr. Pruitt, knocked twice and slid an envelope beneath the door of the classroom without a word. She had finished the lesson first. She had made her students copy every verb twice. Only then did she fold the letter into her apron pocket and walk the 3 blocks back to Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house, where she had lived for the past 2 years while she taught the children of Abilene and waited for her life to properly begin. She read it standing up, which she would later think was fitting, because there was nothing in that letter worth sitting down for. Thomas Avery Whitfield, the man she was to marry in 11 days, had written in his careful, slanted hand that he was sorry, that he was truly and genuinely sorry, but that he had accepted a position in Philadelphia with his uncle's importing firm, and that the life he had promised her in Colorado was no longer a life he could offer. He wished her every happiness. He had signed it with his full name, which struck her as a particular kind of cruelty, as though he needed her to know exactly who had done this. Margaret read it once. Then she read it again. Then she folded it along its original crease, placed it back in the envelope, and sat down on the edge of her bed because her legs, it turned out, had made a decision her mind had not yet caught up to. She was 23 years old. She was, by any honest measure, beautiful, dark-haired, and sharp-eyed, with the kind of face that made men speak more carefully and women pay attention. She had a teaching certificate, a small trunk of books, $14.60 in a tin beneath her bed, and a wedding dress, currently being held for her at Miller's dry goods store, that she had not yet paid for in full. What she did not have was anywhere to go. Her parents were gone, her father to a fever 3 winters past, her mother the year before that. She had no brothers. She had a cousin in Georgia she had met once as a child. She had a position at the school through the end of the term, which bought her perhaps 4 months. She had a room at Mrs. Hennessy's for as long as she could pay for it. Beyond that, she had the letter, and the name signed at the bottom of it, and the specific weight of being a woman alone in a place that had only ever seen her as half of something larger. She did not cry that night. She made a list instead, which was what her mother had always done in hard moments, not because lists solved anything, but because they gave the mind something to do while the heart caught up. The list was short. It did not inspire confidence. It was Mrs. Hennessy who mentioned the name first, 3 weeks later, over breakfast. By then, the town knew. Of course it knew. Abilene was a cattle town with wide streets and a narrow memory, and a schoolteacher left without a groom was the kind of story that moved faster than the stagecoach. Margaret had endured the looks with her chin level and her voice steady, and if she felt the weight of those looks pressing down on her each time she walked to the schoolhouse, she gave no outward sign of it. "Elias Beaumont is looking for someone," Mrs. Hennessy said, filling Margaret's coffee cup without being asked. "A housekeeper. Possibly a tutor, too, if the arrangement suited." Margaret looked up from her toast. "I'm a schoolteacher, not a housekeeper. You're a woman who needs steady work and a place to land," Mrs. Hennessy said, not unkindly. "Elias Beaumont has a big house 2 miles east of town, a telegraph office he runs, and a daughter who hasn't had proper schooling since her mother passed. He doesn't say much, and he doesn't cause trouble. That's about all I know of him that's worth knowing." Margaret considered this for a moment. "How old is the daughter?" 7, maybe 8. She drank her coffee. She looked out the window at the wide Kansas sky, which was putting on its usual morning performance of blinding gold and pale blue, indifferent to the particular troubles of those beneath it. "I'll think about it," she said. She thought about it for exactly 1 day. Then she put on her good gray dress and walked east out of town. The house was not what she expected. She had braced herself for something neglected and sorry-looking, the home of a man managing alone, which in her experience meant dishes and disorder, and a general air of things sliding quietly sideways. But the Beaumont house stood solid and well-kept at the end of a long drive lined with cottonwood trees, their leaves catching the afternoon light. The porch boards were new. The windows were clean. There was a kitchen garden along the south side that showed signs of recent care, the rows straight and weeded, though the harvest had mostly come and gone. A man was repairing a section of fence at the near corner of the property when she came up the drive. He was tall and lean in the way of men who worked hard and ate simply, with dark hair going silver at the temples and hands that moved, with the unhurried certainty of someone who had done this particular task many hundreds of times. He did not look up immediately when she approached. He finished driving the nail he had started, set the hammer down in the grass, and then turned. His eyes were a quiet gray. He looked at her the way a careful man looks at something he is trying to understand before he makes a judgment about it. "Miss Calloway," he said. Not a question, Mrs. Hennessy had, apparently, been busy. "Mr. Beaumont," she said, "I understand you may be in need of a tutor." He studied her for a moment. There was nothing impolite in it. He was simply a man who seemed to take his time about things, as if the world rewarded patience more often than people gave it credit for. "Come up to the porch," he said. "I'll get Clara." The girl was small for her age, with her father's gray eyes and a serious way of holding her mouth that made her look older than 8. She shook Margaret's hand as formally as any adult, and when Margaret asked her to read a passage aloud from the primer she had brought in her bag, Clara did so slowly and carefully, and without a single error, though her brow furrowed at 2 of the longer words, as if they were personal affronts. "She's bright," Margaret said, when Clara had gone back inside. "I know," Elias Beaumont said. He was leaning against the porch railing, arms crossed, watching her with that same measured attention. "Her mother taught her the basics. She hasn't had regular schooling since." "How long has it been?" 2 years. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, exactly, but purposeful, the way silences were between people who were both accustomed to using words carefully. "The arrangement would be room and board," he said. "The spare room at the end of the hall, meals provided, and a wage, modest but fair." He named a figure. It was, she thought, slightly better than modest. And in return, Clara's lessons, mornings, management of the house in the afternoons. Nothing beyond your dignified capacity. He said this simply, without elaboration, as though the dignity of it was a given and not something that needed negotiating. "I won't be underfoot. I keep long hours at the telegraph office in town. You'll have the run of the place." Margaret looked out past the cottonwoods to where the Kansas prairie rolled out flat and gold and enormous under the October sky. She thought about Mrs. Hennessy's boarding house, and the looks along Main Street, and the letter folded in her trunk, and the $14 that had become 11. "I'll need Sundays," she said. "They're yours." She turned back to him. "Then, I accept." He nodded. No celebration. No performance of relief, simply a nod, as if he had expected this, as if the arrangement had already been settled by some prior logic, and this conversation had only been the formality of confirming it. "I'll send the wagon for your things Thursday morning," he said. He picked up his hammer and went back to the fence. The first 2 weeks were quiet in the way of things that are still finding their shape. Margaret established Clara's lessons at the kitchen table from 8 until noon, reading, arithmetic, a little geography, penmanship that the girl approached with the intensity of someone diffusing and explosive. Clara was, as Margaret had suspected from the first day, unusually quick. She absorbed information the way dry ground took rain, fast and complete, and she asked questions that ranged from the sensible to the startling without any apparent awareness of the difference. "Why did your man leave?" Clara asked on the 4th morning, not looking up from her copybook. Margaret kept her expression level. "That's not a lesson subject." "It could be. Under geography, he went to Philadelphia. Pennsylvania is not in our curriculum this week." Clara considered this. "Was he stupid?" "Clara, Papa says only stupid men and cowards leave good things behind." She pressed her pen to the paper with concentration. "I'm just repeating what he said." Margaret looked at the top of the girl's dark head for a long moment. "Copy the sentence twice," she said finally. "Then we'll start fractions." She did not see much of Elias Beaumont in those early weeks. He was out before she rose, back after supper, eating alone at the end of the long table while she and Clara had finished and cleaned up. He left things quietly, without announcement. A second oil lamp appeared on her desk one morning when the nights began to come earlier. A jar of apple preserves showed up on her windowsill 2 days after she had mentioned to Clara, in passing, that she'd missed her mother's preserves. The woodpile beside her window was always replenished before she needed to think about it. She noticed. She said nothing. She told herself it was simply the behavior of a considerate employer. But she noticed. October turned to November, and November turned cold in the particular way of the Kansas plains, which was sudden and complete, as though the prairie had simply decided it was done with warmth and wasn't interested in a gradual transition. Margaret had grown up in Missouri, which had its own version of cold, but the wind here was different. It came across open ground with nothing to slow it, and it had opinions. It was on a Wednesday evening in mid-November that she came downstairs to find Elias Beaumont sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee and a map spread open before him, frowning at it with the same expression Clara used for long division. He looked up. "Miss Calloway, I thought you'd gone to bed. I came for tea." She moved to the stove. "Don't let me disturb you." "You're not." She made her tea and stood at the counter, and for a while there was only the sound of the wind outside, and the pop of the wood stove, and the occasional rustle of the map. "There's a problem with the telegraph line," he said finally, not quite to her, not quite to himself. "Between here and Dodge, third time this season. The wind?" He looked at her. "You know telegraph? My father worked for Western Union for 2 years. I know enough." She brought her tea to the table and sat down across from him, which was either entirely natural or entirely forward, and she wasn't sure which. "Show me." He showed her. They sat for an hour at the kitchen table, talking about line maintenance and weather patterns, and the particular stubbornness of a section of ground that didn't hold posts in the frost. He spoke to her the same way he spoke in all their limited interactions, directly, without condescension, with the quiet assumption that she was intelligent enough to follow and interested enough to engage. She went to bed that night, with her mind still moving over the details of the conversation, the way it did when she'd had a genuinely good exchange with someone worth talking to. The feeling was so familiar and had been so absent these past months that it took her a moment to recognize it. She lay in the dark and recognized it. Then she told herself firmly to go to sleep. December arrived, and with it a development that Margaret had not anticipated. Thomas Whitfield wrote again. The letter came to the school, forwarded from Mrs. Hennessy's. It was longer this time, and more elaborate in its apologies, and it contained the information delivered as though it were a footnote rather than a detonation that Thomas was now engaged to his employer's niece in Philadelphia, a fact which had apparently come about rather quickly. Margaret read it in the schoolroom after her students had gone home. She read it twice, as she had the first letter. Then she folded it, and she thought about what it meant, not for her heart, which had apparently made its own accommodations in the months since August, but for the specific question of Thomas Whitfield's character. He had left her for a better opportunity. That was the plain truth of it, stripped of all the careful language and the genuine sorries. He had left her the way a man leaves a position that no longer serves his advancement, and he had done it 11 days before their wedding because he had been too proud or too cowardly to say it to her face. She had spent months wearing the weight of his decision like something she had done wrong. She set the letter on the desk. She thought of Clara asking, without any cruelty in it, whether he had been stupid. She thought of Elias Beaumont at the fence line the first day, finishing his nail before he turned to look at her. She thought of the oil lamp and the apple preserves and the replenished woodpile, small and unannounced and consistent. She folded the letter and put it in her apron pocket. On her way home, and she noted, as she thought it, that she thought of it as home, she stopped at the post office and mailed a brief reply. It said only that she wished Thomas and his fiancée every happiness, and that she considered the matter closed. She signed it with her full name. She did not feel grief when she dropped it in the box. She felt, if anything, a strange and specific lightness, like a window opened in a room that had been shut too long. She told Clara about it that evening. In the practical way, she handled most things with the girl directly, without drama, as information Clara could process and set aside. "He's marrying someone else," Clara repeated, working through her supper. "He is. And you're all right?" "I think I am," Margaret said, which was the most honest thing she could have said. Clara ate in silence for a moment. Then, "Papa said last week you were the best thing that had happened to this house in a long time." "He said it to the horse, but I heard." Margaret set down her fork. "You told me this because?" Clara looked up with her father's gray eyes. "I thought you should know," she said simply, and went back to her supper. She might have let it rest there. A wiser woman, or a more cautious one, might have filed the information away and kept the arrangement exactly as it was: professional, warm, sufficient. She had a room and a wage and useful work and a child who was, month by month, becoming something like a friend. She did not need to press at the edges of it. But knowledge, once received, changes the shape of the room you're standing in. And Margaret Calloway had never been a woman who was comfortable pretending she didn't know things she knew. On a Thursday evening in late January, with snow coming down in a steady, serious way outside, she knocked on the door of the room Elias used as an office. He looked up from the accounts he was working on. "Clara told me what you said," she said, "to the horse." He was quiet for a moment. Then, I wondered if she'd heard that. "She hears most things." "She does." He set down his pen. He looked at her with the same careful attention he had given everything since the day she arrived, and she realized, looking back now from this vantage point, that he had been looking at her that way from the very first, not with the assessment of an employer measuring a potential hire, but with the particular focus of a man trying to understand something he found genuinely worth understanding. "It was true," he said. "I know," she said. "I think I've known for a while." "And?" She leaned against the doorframe, not quite in the room, not quite out of it, which felt honest. "And I'm not afraid of it," she said. "I was, for a time. After Thomas, I thought I was done being unafraid of things. But I'm not." He stood up from the desk. He crossed the room to where she stood, unhurried, the way he did everything. He stopped at a respectful distance. "I'm not a man who makes speeches," he said. "I know that too. This house has been quiet a long time. I know. I'd like it to be less quiet." She looked at him, at the silver in his hair, and the steadiness in his gray eyes, and the hands that had left an oil lamp on her desk without being asked, had stacked firewood in the dark so she wouldn't wake to cold, had said to a horse what a more practiced man might have said with flowers and declarations. "Funny," she said, and her voice was quiet. "I've been meaning to talk to you about that." They did not rush it, which was the right way. There was a Sunday walk in February, along the frozen edge of the creek that ran east of the property, where he showed her the shapes of deer tracks in the snow, and she showed him an easier route for the telegraph line she'd been thinking about since November. There was a shared supper in March that lasted 2 hours past Clara's bedtime. There was a morning in April when she came downstairs to find he had learned to make the particular kind of strong, dark coffee her father had made, the kind she had described once, offhandedly, 3 months ago, as the thing she missed most about home. She stood at the kitchen door with the spring light coming in, and looked at the cup on the table and understood, in the way you understand things that have been true for a long time before you named them, that she had not been waiting for Thomas Whitfield to come back. She had been waiting for this. For a man who listened when she wasn't watching, who built things quietly and well, who spoke to her like someone worth speaking to. She picked up the cup. She sat down. She called out that breakfast could wait a few minutes if he wanted to come drink his coffee before the day started. He came. They sat in the yellow April morning and drank their coffee and talked about the creek and the telegraph and whether Clara was ready for Latin, which Margaret thought yes, and Elias thought was slightly ambitious, and Margaret said that was exactly the kind of thinking that had produced 3 months of remedial fractions when Clara had been ready for algebra in November, and he acknowledged this with the particular expression of a man who is privately amused and publicly outnumbered. Clara came downstairs in the middle of it, looked at them both, and went to the cupboard for her own cup with the air of someone who had been waiting a long time for the adults to sort themselves out. There is a thing that happens in a house when it stops being empty. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't arrive all at once. It comes the way spring comes on the prairie first, in small signs you might miss if you were looking for something larger. And then one morning you step outside, and the air is different, and you understand that the ground has been working beneath the frost all winter long, turning quietly toward this. Margaret Elias Calloway had come to this house with $11 and a gray dress and the specific, heavy knowledge of being a woman alone in a place that had only ever seen her as half of something. She had come without anyone to meet her, without a plan beyond the next term and the next wage and the next day. What she found slowly, unhurried, as all the best things arrive, was not rescue. She was not a woman who needed rescuing. She was a woman who needed room. Room to put down the letter and stop apologizing for the weight of it. Room to be intelligent and capable and occasionally right about fractions. Room to become, in her own time and her own way, the thing she had always been before August, a woman who was not afraid of the life in front of her. Elias Beaumont had given her room. He had given it the way he gave everything, without ceremony, without condition, with the steady, practical love of a man who believed that the best things you could do for another person were small and consistent and never asked to be noticed. By summer, the cottonwood trees were loud with birds, and the kitchen garden was green, and the schoolroom she had turned the south bedroom into a proper one, with maps on the wall and Clara's work tacked in rows, smelled of chalk and ink, and the lavender she kept in a jar on the windowsill. On a Sunday evening in July, she and Elias sat on the porch in the long gold light, and Clara had gone to bed early for once without being asked, and the prairie stretched out in every direction, patient and enormous and entirely indifferent, and Margaret thought about the letter in the trunk and the $14 and the way she had stood in Mrs. Hennessy's room reading her name signed at the bottom of someone else's decision about her life. She thought about the oil lamp, the apple preserves, the coffee in the morning. Exactly right. She looked at the man beside her, who was looking out at the darkening sky with the same face he turned toward everything he took seriously. "Was any of this what you expected?" she asked. He thought about it, in the way he thought about everything, actually thought about it, turned it over, gave it the attention it deserved. "No," he said. "Me neither." The first star appeared low in the east, tentative and bright. "Better or worse?" she asked. He turned to look at her, and he almost smiled. That particular, restrained expression she had come to understand meant something that a different man might have said with considerably more words. "Ask me again in 50 years, he said. She thought that was, in its way, the most complete answer she had ever received to any question. She looked back out at the prairie, at the stars coming one by one out of the deep blue dark, and she felt not happiness exactly, which had always struck her as too small a word for the thing it was meant to describe, but something steadier and quieter than that, something that did not require maintenance or apology. Something that had been built, like the porch boards and the fence and the telegraph line, carefully and well, by a person who believed in doing things right. The house behind them was full of Clara's books and Margaret's maps, and the smell of coffee, and the sound of two people learning the particular language of each other's silences. It was not empty. It had not been empty. She understood now, for a very long time. Sometimes, the most important thing a heartbreak can teach us isn't about the person who left. It's about the room it clears for something quieter and truer to arrive. Margaret didn't find love by searching for it. She found it by doing her work, staying honest, and allowing herself to be known by someone who paid attention. The right people show up in oil lamps and apple preserves and coffee made exactly right. A small note for you. This story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of warmth and entertainment, while carrying a small, genuine light worth keeping.